or we will mute you. All right. Well, this is I'm we're so excited. We have 46 participants. I'd like to say 46 screens on Zoom right now. That's got to be a record, close to a record for us. That's wonderful. And I assume before we're finished here, it'll be a lot higher. So Wendy and I are the co-presidents of the Native Plant Society of New Mexico. And we are also Gila chapter members. I'm a board member.
I'm a lackey.
Yeah. So Margie Gibson is our president. And I'd just like to say that the Gila chapter is just always amazing to me. Here we are, 10,000 people or so in Silver City, and of course we have the hinterlands. But the Gila Native Plant Society just surpassed Santa Fe as the second highest membership chapter in the state of New Mexico. So we are doing things very, very well, and we're so excited about that. So I guess just Albuquerque, look out.
Okay.
And it's all because of our volunteers, people that are willing to work events, to run for leadership positions. It's so, so important. And I know we have representatives from other chapters of the Native Plant Society in New Mexico. You know, we have the Native Plant Society of Mexico has the highest membership that we have ever had. And our finances are great. We can do some great things, but it all is a volunteer effort. So please, please, please step up. You don't have to step up for 10 years. You can step up for, a special group or a special assignment, whatever. But just please help us out. It's so, so important. On Friday, February 16th, we're going to have what I call, anyway, the history and future of the Silver Creek Botanical Garden. We always have our meetings the third Friday of the month at 7:00. And Betsy Kaida, who I call the head grounds person on the Cactus Hill at the Silver Creek Botanical Garden, will be presenting along with, let's see, what's that guy's name? He's got long hair and a beard. Oh, yeah, Elroy Limmer the trimmer. He's going to be co-presenting with Betsy. It's going to be a fascinating story about the Gila chapter has been doing for so many years. All right. So without further ado, make sure you're muted. We're going to use the chat box tonight for questions. We're going to take questions at the end of the presentation. So just use the chat box, ask your question, try to be concise. It's not, you don't need like 3 or 4, 8 paragraphs. And
you can put that question in anytime that it occurs to you, but they'll be addressed at the end.
Yeah, put it in right now. So this is the bad joke kind of thing. So native bees are all abuzz these days. But seriously, those of us in the native plant community realize that native bees are so vital to our native plants. The native plants need the native bees need the native plants. And so our speaker, Ali Naria, is going to tell us all about that. He is a PhD student at the University of Texas in El Paso, and we're going to have an overview of native bees that we could see in our area, their life histories, the plants that they tend to. I mean, some of these native bees are only able to go and pollinate one certain plant group or even a genus. So it's just amazing. And then what I love about this presentation, as we've seen it before in El Paso, is that we're going to learn how to as gardeners and those that want to introduce native plants to our yards and our spaces, that we can use some techniques to attract these bees to make a wonderful habitat. So, without further ado, so Ali, you're on.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm so honored to get to talk to you folks about this because, yeah, honestly, the native plant community and the native bee community, we should be best friends. I completely agree. I'm also honored that you remembered, I mean, all the stuff that I talked about in the presentation. I have changed some things up, so hopefully will be at least slightly new for you, Don and Wendy. All right, let's see if my little laptop can hang in here. All right, is everyone able to see that?
Looks good.
Okay, perfect. I was about to say it. Whoops, everyone muted themselves, and here I am asking questions. So yes, like Don mentioned, my name is Oliver or Ollie Neria. I'm a PhD student in just my second semester out at the University of Texas, El Paso, and I'm in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology program. And so this is my presentation. If you plant it, they will come. Meet the bees in your neighborhood and their favorite native plants. As a general overview, some of the things that I'll be talking about today will be some general facts and characteristics of native bees. As you'll learn, there are so many and they're all so variable. It's a little tough to generalize, but I tried to sum up a few basic topics that hopefully you can use as you're trying to observe them in your own yards. I also do have an extensive section now about interactions with native plants, which I hope at least that you will find pretty interesting. I'll talk about common bees in the desert Southwest, which I was just talking with Wendy about. You all out in Silver City are in a slightly different ecoregion than I am here in El Paso, but hopefully you should be able to recognize a ton of these. And finally, gardening for pollinators. I'm hoping if you're in this presentation, this is going to be of interest to you, because again, native plants and native bees, you need one to have the other. So to start out with, what is a bee? So generally, these are insects that feed on pollen and nectar. As you can see, our friend here on the left, completely covered in pollen. The larvae are really the ones that eat the pollen. The adults typically are visiting flowers to gather that pollen and take it home for their larvae, their babies. The adults are basically just feeding on that nectar, that sugar water, that gives them just enough fuel to fly. And interestingly enough, in the past, I'd say 4 or 5 years, there was a molecular analysis, a phylogeny that was created, a tree of where bees fall within the wasps, the Hymenoptera, the order that they are part of. And it was found that bees are actually basically a type of wasp. They are well within many other groups of wasps that behave and appear similarly to them. So I like to call them vegan wasps. They're essentially wasps that learned to provision their nests with pollen as a protein source and feed that to their young, rather than caterpillars or spiders or other insects that you might see wasps gathering. So bees, there's around 20,000 species worldwide. And in the US and Canada, you can find around 4,000. I think the current estimate I've got here on the screen, 3,600 species. And of those, in New Mexico, you have around 1,000 species. That may be between 1,000, 2,000. Estimates are kind of rough right now. And many more bees are being described even as we speak. And there are also a few non-native species, which I'll take a moment to address just for a second. So what is a native bee? A native bee is any bee that evolved here in the United States, right? Especially here in New Mexico. These are bees that have these long-lasting and very complex relationships with the flowers that they forage on. And I'll talk more about those relationships, but this beautiful graphic, I feel, illustrates a good number of the different shapes and sizes and colors you can see in bees. And this is from the Pollinator Partnership, pollinator.org, a fantastic resource that I think I have at the end as well. So then what is a non-native bee? So the most common non-native bee that you'll come across is Apis mellifera. This is the European, or also known as the Western honeybee. And these are fairly recognizable. They're some of the only bees we have in the United States that form those massive colonies. So if you see a giant nest full of thousands of bees, chances are that's going to be the Western honeybee, the European honeybee. And don't fret, I mean, they're here, they're present. There are people who farm them, which I use honey. I put it in my tea all the time. I'm not here to rag on the honeybees. I will just say, in terms of conservation, these guys are not really the ones that we're going to be focusing on today. In terms of attracting your native pollinators, they're typically going to have a completely different lifestyle. And so it's important to make the distinction here. And I do apologize if anyone here is hoping to hear about honeybees. I don't know very much about them, and I'm so sorry. But continuing on, why should we even care about native bee biodiversity? Well, the reason is, of those 1,000 or 2,000 different bees that I talked about that you can find in New Mexico, there's a huge variation in between each of those species. And I'll go into detail on some of those variations and ways that they affect a bee's ability to pollinate a given plant. So that can include things like their floral preference, which flowers they're going to go to over others. As Dawn mentioned, there are some I'll talk about that are specialists. They can only go to a certain number of species or genera of flowers. Their behavior and seasonality can also be quite different from species to species. Their nesting habits, or areas that they can basically access, especially when we're talking about urban adapted bees, can also vary quite a bit. Their morphology, so the way that they're shaped. I mean, here on the screen, we've got a quite striking difference. On the left there, that little guy, that's a perdita, or a mining bee, a fairy bee they're also called. And sitting on that quarter is a carpenter bee, which in the desert Southwest, we know our carpenter bees, and they're highly intimidating, but just complete teddy bears. I'll talk about them some more later. And finally, they're pollen carrying, which of course, the way that a pollen grain falls off of a bee and where it falls on the flower, highly important, especially when you get down into like the different methods or mechanisms that plants have for pollination. So I'll go into some more detail here, starting with the floral preferences. Again, as Dawn mentioned, this is a spectrum from generalists down to specialists. So bees that are generalists don't really seem to mind whether they're feeding on an aster or a legume. They kind of just go for whatever's available. And a great example of this is here on the right. This is Xylocopa sonorina, our valley carpenter bee. This is very common, at least here in El Paso, and I think across the desert Southwest, you're going to see these guys. And so they'll even feed from flowers that they don't actually fit into because they're too large. And they'll kind of nip the side of it and nectar rob, which I talk about. There's also the specialists. This term oligolecty that I have here on the screen, I'm only including it for anyone that might already be familiar with native bees. This is kind of a hot topic in the native bee community at the moment, where there's a monolecty, oligolecty. There's kind of a debate about where is specialist, what is considered a specialist, because this is a spectrum. So where I fall on this debate is that I consider bees that eat pollen and nectar from a genus to be a specialist, where some people will say you're not a specialist unless you're feeding from one species. I think a genus is pretty specialized. And so when you're dealing especially with specialist bees, or any bees that fall towards that side of the spectrum where they're a little bit pickier about the flowers that they go to, they can have pretty complex relationships with their host plants, especially when you're talking about things developing and evolving together here out in the desert. So here's some example of some specialists that we see locally. On the left there, that's Diadasia diminuta, the diminutive globe mallow bee, or the globe mallow bee. They are specialists on Sphaeralcia globe mallow. And I mean, with Sphaeralcia especially, advertise like crazy, they go along the roadside. Diadasia diminuta takes full advantage of this. On the right here, we have Peponapus pruinosa, the squash bee. These guys are completely only will feed on plants within the Cucurbidae family, and they especially love Cucurbita. They love our squash, our gourds, pumpkins, and as a result of co-evolving with plants from this family, they're also some of the most effective pollinators of Cucurbita. Oh my goodness, I forget I'm talking to plant people. I can't pronounce anything. They're great pollinators of gourd plants, which is great news if you have a food garden and you're trying to grow, squash and things like that. I'll talk about ways that that you can hopefully get them into your yard. So on the topic of these specialist bees co-evolving and really striving to fall in line with their host plants, seasonality is incredibly important for bees. So bees are sort of like flies in terms of their life history. They go through complete metamorphosis. Between a bee and a butterfly, you don't really see bee caterpillars or bee larvae just kind of running around that we see butterfly larvae running around. The reason for that goes back to what I talked about in the beginning, where bees are provisioning the nests for these larvae. They're packing a lunch for their kids so that their kids don't have to go out and into the world and get eaten or stay in their nests. And usually that's where they're going to spend the winter, a larva or a pupa. The adult form bee, that's where we're really going to be able to see them. So the emergence time of these bees, the times that you're seeing them come out and feed on these flowers, gather the pollen, drink the nectar, that is usually triggered by very unique environmental conditions. Here in the desert, that's usually humidity. A lot of our bees are triggered by the summer rains, right? Or the late summer, early fall rains that we tend to get. That's when the majority of our plants are kind of springing back to life. That's when they have enough water, enough energy to kind of throw flowers out. And so a lot of our bees will emerge then. But even within that, you'll see some are early summer bees, some are late summer bees, some are only present when their specific host plant is flowering. They are that complex and they've co-evolved that closely with their flower. They need to time that right or else they can't eat. So most of these bees only live a few weeks as adults. So again, this timing is just incredibly important. If they miss that window, they can starve. On the right here, this is Osmia ribiflorus. At least out here in El Paso, we see these pretty early in the spring, around March and April, May. They go to our Mahonia, the agarita. They go to Mexican redbud. They are sort of on the specialist end. They tend to look a little pickier about what they eat because they're so early in the season. There really isn't much out there. So these guys especially have to time their emergence perfectly, or they can experience a cold snap, or they can miss the window of flowers entirely. So moving on from there, on to some other behaviors. So this is just a fun one that I added a little recently. Buzz pollination. This is a behavior that only a few bees can do. I'm going to go ahead and play the video. I'm not sure you'll be able to hear the sound, but hopefully you'll be able to see what he's doing or what she's doing. Let's see. Uh-oh. There goes my laptop. Oh, here we go. Okay, so I hope that you could hear that. If may be able to just paste the link for it in the chat after the presentation. Essentially, what's happening here, this is something that is usually present in plants in the Solanaceae family. They'll have their anthers. Oh, I didn't mean to skip ahead. Oh no. Oh no. Well, I guess we'll finish one video. Oh, there it goes. Okay, so here's an example. This, I think, is a nightshade. And we have silver. Now, a lot of these nightshades, their anthers are closed at the end. So in order for a bee to get pollen out of the plant, they have to buzz their wing muscles at a specific frequency. As you can see here, I think a team fork that they pressed up against the silver bees, sort of like they rolled around in a Cheeto bag. And here, a bee that's capable of buzz pollinating is kind of the only on certain kinds of bees. Okay, so moving on from there before my laptop bursts into flames. Oh, it may have. Oh, good. There we go. Hopefully I haven't lost y'all. So on another topic of bee behavior, their nesting. There's another spectrum here of their sociality, how many bees will nest together, essentially. And this can affect things like, so for the example in the picture here, these are some honeybees, which, as I mentioned, are not native, but are one of our few eusocial species that are present here in the United States. Eusociality is rare, but when you do have a large group of bees all in one place, they can all sort of exhaust, especially in the desert, pollen and nectar resources. So it's important to watch out for when you see a large group of bees. Just remember, pollen and nectar are finite resources. There's also communal bees, which live together in their nests, but don't have that same structure of queens and workers and drones. It's usually a group of sisters all in the same generation that are just living together. And finally, our most common level of sociality is completely solitary. Most of our bees here in the desert Southwest live completely by themselves. And what will happen is, let me move to the next slide to show you, the females will create their own nests. So here, these are examples of some ground nesting bees. And these examples are solitary. There are some communal, but these are solitary. Around 70% of our native bees are ground nesting bees. And this makes perfect sense when you think about it. We are in the desert. It makes sense that they're going to take advantage of all of this empty desert that we've got, all this sand and space. Most of these bees are going to excavate their own burrows. Some exceptions to that would be like bumblebees. Bumblebees will use existing structures underground, usually left by rabbits or rodents, and they'll just kind of take over that home. But examples like these here on the screen, Diadasia there on the top, and Lasioglossum on the bottom, are excavating and digging and carrying all of the dirt out and provisioning their nests with that pollen, foraging. They're kind of just doing it all. With ground nesting bees, they do also have preferences that limit where they're going to be able to live. That includes things like soil textures, the location, and especially in reference to flowers that are available to them, and soil drainage. You don't really want your house to flood. So all of these things get taken into account by these bees. With ground nesting bees, they do have a little bit of a harder time establishing in urban areas because we humans like to cover things with pavement and have no empty space. But the good news being in, again, the Southwest, we do have plenty of space for them, especially at the edge of town. And some of these do nest in aggregations. Oh, this picture here, by the way, of the Lasioglossum, the reason I have an arrow pointing off to the side here, I wanted to give a sense of scale for how small these Lasioglossum are. That picture Dr. Kevin Floyd took of a Lasioglossum, it's sitting on my fingertip. So that's my finger, and it's just a itty bitty little bee. And these little girls, they'll go and they'll dig out their nest, and it can go several inches into the ground. It's incredible. So just something to watch out for. They might not always be incredibly obvious, but if you sit and watch some flowers, you may see them, and I'll talk about that too. So we also have cavity nesting bees. The examples here are a leafcutter bee, a small carpenter bee, and the full-size carpenter bees there on the right. So that was left to right. Cavity nesting bees usually are nesting in pre-existing cavities. So think if you've ever seen a bee hotel, or if you've ever seen, just small little holes in a tree, in cracks in a rock wall. These are just some examples of places that these bees are happy to move into. They do have advantage over ground nesters in urban areas for this reason. They basically will make a nest anywhere that they can fit inside of. And here are the examples that I've given. The only one here that does not nest completely solitary or independently would be the carpenter bees here on the right. And also, honeybees are technically also cavity nesters. They will move into hollowed out trees. They'll move into water utility covers, famously. They move into all kinds of places. So cavity nesters are eager to move in. They don't care what it is. They'll use it. All right, so now the exciting part. Just a really broad overview of some bee families that you can find in the desert Southwest. So I won't get into all of these families, and I don't get into much detail either, mostly because as Dawn and Wendy and I were just talking about, I kind of really need to get out there and see what you all have. But these are some that I know for sure you will see. So the overview of the bee families here, we have 6 major families. We have the Apidae, which are the carpenter bees, the digger bees, bumblebees, longhorned bees, and honeybees. We have the Andrenidae, the miner bees and the fairy bees. The Coletidae are the cellophane bees and the mast bees. The Halictidae are basically the sweat bees, which is a strange name, and I'll get into it. The Megachilidae are the leafcutter, mason, and resin bees, mostly just completely cavity nesting family. And the Melitidae, which I don't think I talk about because we only have a couple of species present in the area, but they are here. I think they're in the Bees in Your Backyard, a book that I'll mention here later as well. And we'll get into it. Here are the Apidae. This is an incredibly diverse group in terms of their floral preferences, their sociality, their nesting habits, really just across the board. This is an enormous family. But generally, looking at these pictures here, they tend to be large, fuzzy, and ground nesting bees. There are exceptions to this, as there are many exceptions to some of the things I'll tell you about each of these families, but that goes for the vast majority of them. I do have a breakdown here in the left corner of some of the subfamilies that you can see, especially here in the desert. But I'll go ahead and just go over the ones I've got here in the pictures. So in the top left, that is a Eucerine male. The Eucerini are the longhorned bees named for these giant long antennae that the males have. The females have shorter antennae, but you'll notice they'll be interacting with one another. So if you're sitting outside and you see one of these, they love sand sunflower, or really any sunflower. If you see one of these longhorn bees that seems to be following another bee around, that's probably a female longhorn. Then in the top right, we do have Apis mellifera, the European honeybee, very, very common, especially if you live near agriculture or near anyone who has a honeybee hive. In the bottom right, we have Bombus sonorus, the Sonoran bumblebee. This is a very common bumblebee in the desert Southwest across the board, as the name suggests, right? The Sonoran bumblebee. And there's also Diadasia there on the bottom left. So that is another ground nesting bee. They tend to like cacti. They tend to also like sunflowers and asters. And the globe mallow bee that I mentioned earlier, the specialist Onsferalcia, is also a part of this genus. So they have a few specialists, but in general, it's a little hard to tell them apart. So you'd have to really follow them around and see what they land on to try to work out who they are. So moving on from here, I think I do have, yes, the small carpenter bees. This is the exception to the rule about the apids being large and fuzzy. These small carpenter bees are in the same family, and they're the closest living relatives, I believe, of Xylocopa, the regular, large, intimidating carpenter bees that we have that I mentioned earlier. So these are small and solitary, cavity nesting, and generalist bees. So all of these words together, I know, I just taught you these terms. I'm already throwing them out here. But don't fret. Here in the top right, this is kind of to give you a sense of scale and also to show you them in the act of cavity nesting. These bees are so small, their preferred nesting site is usually inside of pithy reed-stemmed plants. So, for example, you may have some asters that have grown over time. It's the end of the season, they've sort of died off. And the inside of that is now a little soft, it's a little nice and hollow. These bees will go and move in. They chew their way down into this dead stem, and they'll lay their eggs and provision their eggs inside of this stem. And I'll talk about ways that you can help small cavity nesting bees like this, but they're really fascinating little guys. I hope that you get to see some. So here are the larger carpenter bees on the left. That's Xylocopa. And I also had, I put up Bombus, the Sonoran bumblebees here on the right, sort of to give you a way to tell apart carpenter bees from bumblebees. Because I know these large-bodied bees, at least here in El Paso where I live, a lot of folks will call carpenter bees bumblebees because, it's a large bee, completely understandable, and they're in the same family. So in the Southwest, good news is it's not like out east where they have a really hard time telling them apart. For the most part, if it is black or yellow, as you see on the left, that's Xylocopa. That's a carpenter bee. The females are that dark black or blue color, and the males are teddy bear bees. They're blonde. They're hilarious. You'll have to watch for them. They'll go and chase each other around. It's really, really entertaining. On the right there, that's the bumblebee. That's the Sonoran bumblebee, black and yellow. Another way you can tell them apart is Xylocopa, the carpenter bees, have pollen pants. So you'll see they're just completely covered in pollen, where Bombus has a corbicula or a pollen basket. They'll sort of just have one little ball that's stuck to their leg. This is also true for honeybees. So I'll go ahead and move on here to the Andrenids. These are the minor bees. This is sort of a smaller family than the apids. And I'll talk mostly about Andrena. Andrena is a solitary and ground nesting generalist bee. They're about medium-sized, probably about the size of a honeybee. Very fuzzy. Just if you look at this, she is just completely covered in fuzz, even on the front of her face. And they sort of have a slightly more elongate body than a honeybee. You probably would have to see one next to the other to really be able to tell. But hopefully by the end of this, you'll be convinced to sit out and observe your flowers and watch for these. And hopefully you'll train your eye on how to tell these apart. So the Andrena are one of the larger genera of the Andrenidae family, which is why they're sort of the titular genus of this group. The females have these really prominent scopa, so the pollen-carrying hairs there on the back leg again, of their hind femur. The males are still a little fuzzy, but they don't really help with the provisioning, so they're maybe a little less fuzzy. Again, though, watch for the interactions. That's always how I'm able to tell, oh, that's the male and that's the female. Here's another example of an andrenid, which is honestly one of the most incredible bee species that we have in our area. This is Perdita minima. So what I've done here is I have a picture of Euphorbia albomarginata, the white margin sandmat, which does occur in your area. It's there on the left. For a sense of scale, this is a minuscule plant. I know you all are the plant people. Hopefully you've seen it in person and know exactly what I'm talking about, but it's tiny. And that on the right in the bubble is Perdita minima on top of one of the little flowers. They are tiny. This is the smallest bee in the entire world, and it occurs here in the Chihuahuan Desert, and as well as into the different ecoregions around you. I think it's also in the Sonoran. Moving on, and I'm sorry, there are so many bee families. It's a lot of information, but I'll give you some other references to hopefully help you retain and use some of this information in your gardens. But these are the Caledids, or the family Caledidae. On the top here, that's Caletes. That is a cellophane bee, one of the main groups of Caledidae. On the bottom are the Hylaeus, or the masked bees. Bees in this family are basically called cellophane bees because of this really cool kind of cellophane-looking secretion that they use to waterproof their nests. They're ground nesting bees. And I have a picture here to show you. So this is what the cellophane lining of a Caledid nest looks like. These were extracted from the ground so that you can see them better. But hopefully, if you do see a bee that's active digging in your soil in your garden, you'll know exactly what that might look like. All right, and here are the halictids, or the sweat bees. This is sort of an unfortunate nickname that they've picked up. I think this is a gorgeous group, as you can tell from the top photo there. That's Agapostemon. That is this bright green, metallic, beautiful bee. They're called sweat bees, though, because they tend to like the mineral content in human sweat. So sometimes if you're outside working, it's the desert, it's summer, you're probably a little sweaty. You may have them land on you. They're not trying to hurt you or anything like that. It can be annoying, though. But again, just such a strange name for this glorious family. In any case, this is a huge and very diverse family of bees, which is why unfortunately, I don't really go into much detail here. It's a little hard to tell many of them apart, aside from the ones that I've put here on your screen. Agapostemon, again, there on the top, and Alasia glossum on the bottom, which I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the ground nesting bee and the one that was perched on my finger. For this entire family, they are just all over the board. They have social behaviors where some of these are eusocial, like honeybees, in smaller numbers, but they have a queen. They have the cooperative brood care where there's multiple generations all taking care of all of the young together. It's fascinating. And even within species, single species, they can flip back and forth between living by themselves or making a huge colony. Their nesting habits, unfortunately, are also variable, super variable, and many of them are generalists, but there are specialists in this family as well. So I apologize. This is one that I could not generalize into a nice little packet for you all, but hopefully, if you use some of the references that I'll give you at the end here, you can begin looking for these in your gardens and begin recognizing them, especially the ones that are more common in your area. So moving on to a much more recognizable group, these are the megachilids. These are the leafcutter bees and the mason bees. Across the board, I think these are all cavity nesting bees, and most, if not all, are also solitary. They have their pollen-carrying hairs on the underside of their abdomen or their tummy. You can kind of see them here on this beautiful female leafcutter bee, where the little yellow hairs are poking out from underneath her belly. That's where she would pack in her pollen. Many of these bees are recognizable just by their coloration. They are usually black and white, usually have pretty prominent banding. But in terms of what they like to eat and where they like to nest, that can also be all across the board. I know some of the ones that we have, I'll go ahead and advance to show you the picture. There we go. So some of the ones we have, like this mega Kylie here above, they like nesting inside of rock walls. So if you have crevices in your rock walls, you may think about sitting out there and watching for a while. Some of these will pop in and out. It's really fascinating. And these are also some of the ones that will make use of bee hotels, which I'll talk about. If you've never heard of a bee hotel, I'll go into some detail on that. In any case, one of the really cool things about this group is you can recognize them even if you never see the bee. The reason I say that, there's a picture here of a leaf that's got this perfect little circle cut out of it, almost like someone took a hole puncher and punched out a hole on this leaf. And this is a leaf of a clematis. I think, yeah, a pitcher plant or pitcher flower. And basically, this is what you look for. They love roses. I've noticed them on a number of waxy leaved plants. They seem to love the texture of those. And what they do is they'll take that perfect little round slice by landing on the leaf and by sort of scooting their face down as they chomp through the leaf. They then roll up the leaf, take it home, and they will use that to line their nest. And essentially, if you look inside of a nest of one of these guys, especially if you do have a bee hotel, if you ever look inside, it looks like they've packaged their eggs into these little leaf burritos. It's the cutest thing. These can vary in size, so the size of the hole is usually dependent upon whether or not they fit inside of it. So that's another thing to kind of keep in mind should you want to promote cavity nesting bees in your garden, which I think, yeah, I get right into. To encourage native bees in your yard, and I know I just covered a ton of them, and this is great news. I mean, if you want native bees in your yard, they'll come to you. Some of them will come to you. What you can do is treat them like you would any other wild animal, basically. So if you have a bird feeder or you like watching birds or things like that, that's basically what I'm going to equate this to. Is you're going to kind of plant some native flowers, although I'm speaking to the Native Plant Society. You're going to go out and look at your native flowers that you most likely already have and watch for activity. Kind of check and see, like, okay, who do I have here? Do I see any of these really tiny guys that I now am aware they exist? Do I see some cool longhorns like in this picture, or big bumblebees, carpenter bees? You'll then, after you've kind of watched for the activity that already exists in your yard, in your area, you can start to create nesting habitat based on what you've seen. So let's say, I'll give examples actually here in the next slide, but you then, after you've created your nesting habitat, watch for more activity. Is anyone taking advantage of this nesting space? Is there anything that I need to change? Any preferences that these bees might have that I'm not maybe taking into consideration? Make your adjustments and repeat. And you can just continue doing this, and it really is a lot of fun, especially, again, equating it to bird watching. You kind of just go out, watch your flowers, and just think, oh man, okay, so it's you. Okay, let me find out who you are. Let me find out what you like to eat. How can I encourage you to stay, to have your family here? So as the example, so let's say you have sunflowers in your yard and you step outside and you notice there are these large fuzzy bees that are kind of just always on these sunflowers. Okay, well, there's some observations that I can make note of. Like, what time of year are they around? And if they're taking advantage of that plant's blooming period, well, are there other plants in that same family that I can put out and maybe encourage them to continue feeding on? And on top of that, is there a way I can maybe identify this bee and learn about the kind of nest it makes or other flowers it might enjoy? It's, again, just like bird watching. If you see, a finch in your yard, I'm not great at birding, I'm sorry, I'm going to use a finch. If you see a finch in your yard, you'll think, okay, I know they like seeds. Maybe if I put out some seeds for this finch, he'll bring his little finch buddies over here and they can all eat together. That's exactly the way you should approach bees. It's not a solution where you can just, plug and play. Okay, I bought a bee hotel. We're good. I'm good. I've done it. No. It's a very interactive process. And for naturalists, like I'm assuming most of this group is, this is a really fun, engaging activity that really goes year round from March through September. And then through the winter, you're just planting your garden some more. So in terms of the nest itself, For ground nesting bees, which again, this is the vast majority of our bee species here, just all you have to do really is leave spaces of bare earth where you don't really want to plant anything or put any mulch or pave it or till it or anything like that. You just leave it alone and pretend it's part of, the natural desert. Now, I'm not saying, because I understand, of course, we love our plants. I'm not saying you have to go rip everything out and nope, only have bare dirt. That's what Ollie told me to do. Sorry. No, 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 no. This can be a little corner next to your shed. This can be the walkway leading up to your house. That can be anything. Because honestly, walking across bees does not seem to disturb them. They're mostly solitary. They're not going to all come flying out at you. They're just going to kind of wait, clear the entrance, continue. So things like, wood bark mulch or paving all of your surfaces, tilling or planting a complete lawn, all of these things are going to kind of deter ground nesting bees from being able to use your yard as habitat. Tilling especially, if you're tilling your garden, absolutely perfectly fine. Just try to pay attention to the time of year you're doing this. And remember, beneath the ground, like in this image here, there may be bees overwintering. So you may consider waiting until just before the active season when the temperatures rise and understand, well, okay, you may still take some out, but be a little mindful of when you can do these activities that will be the least destructive for bees that may be in your yard that you might not be aware of. And some may nest in your garden. If you notice one, you can just kind of plant a little flag near it and, oh, okay, I'll work around you. And okay, I guess this is your nesting here. Sort of like you would if you have a bird nesting in a tree and you want to trim some branches. Well, you may consider either, okay, maybe I can put this off a little while, or maybe I can trim around it, trying to make a little bit of space for them. Oh, and bumblebee boxes. This is something that I just sort of recently found out about through working with Dr. Kevin Floyd, where bumblebees are making use of existing spaces in the ground. So that, like I said, they move into rabbit burrows or rodent burrows and things like that. If you see bumblebees around, you may consider, if you want a nest of potentially 50 to 100 bees in your yard, if you're okay with that, you may consider looking into these bumblebee boxes. It's essentially like a little bird box. You dig a little hole, you put it in the ground, and you wait and see, just like you would a bird nest. So it's really fun. Of course, I'm biased. The cavity nesters are quite a bit easier, if I'm honest, because, again, as humans, we really like to cover every bit of space we have on the ground. But cavity nesters are super ready to just move into anything you throw out there, like bee hotels. So bee hotels are essentially this picture that I've got on the top here. It can be holes drilled into a plank or a stump of wood. It can be a little box that has straws in it, or pre-made, a box that has little holes drilled out in like a grid pattern. They are a little controversial. I've heard some folks in the native bee community talk about how putting them all in one space might make it easier for, parasitoids, which I haven't talked about, but parasitoids essentially are like cuckoos, like cuckoo birds for bees, where they will steal into the nest and take the material, the provisions that were laid for the other egg, and instead they put their egg inside the nest. So if you put, all the bees together in one space, it might make it easier for them to go door to door, basically, and lay eggs. But as I mentioned, the cavity nesting bees seem to be doing far better in urban areas than our ground nesting bees. So I personally feel that bee hotels are still a really great way to interact with native bees, especially if have people over and, wow, what's that? That's a bee hotel. You want to see the bees? They're not going to sting you. It's really cool. You can watch them carry little leaves and make little leaf burritos. It's awesome. So for that, I love them. I think they're fantastic. Oh, and for Seratina, I do have a separate slide. They're the ones that I mentioned. They're the small carpenter bees that nest inside of stems, so dead plant stems. For stem nesting bees, like those small carpenter bees, it's kind of all about just tolerating that you're going to have some flower stalks. If you're okay with that, if you're okay with having just a little bit of a messy garden, leaving those through the winter, really, it gives them the chance to emerge. If you go and deadhead everything and cut all of your dead plant material out at the end of the season and throw that away, there may be bees that are already nesting inside of there. So you can see, if you look at the diagram for spring, the female bees find these cut or naturally occurring open stems. They go in and lay their nest. In the summer, the bee larvae are developing. your plant is growing, the perennial growth, it's hiding the stem stubble. Through the fall and winter, those bees are hibernating in those stems. Again, they're just waiting for the right emergence trigger, the humidity, the temperature, to become adults and to come out and to forage. So then in spring, once again, if you cut back those dead flower stalks, you've given them the chance. It's warmed up. They've been able to hatch and emerge. So this is a really great infographic I found from the Xerces Society that I love, especially for gardeners, right? This is something that you can do in your own garden. And for other things to encourage native bee populations, the same thing that you would probably already be doing, I'd imagine, not using as many pesticides, tolerating, okay, I guess the caterpillars got that one, that's fine, or avoiding neonicotinoid treated plants. It can be kind of sneaky if you go to, I don't want to name any specific corporations, but those big landscaping stores that you can go to, check the tags. Sometimes it will already be treated. There will be a soil treatment on them. And the bees won't know until after they've eaten, unfortunately. Doing things like that, that's not just going to help bees. That's going to help insects across the board, which unfortunately, I'm sure you probably heard many of them are declining, not just bees. And some other resources that I personally love, the Xerces Society. I was just talking with Don and Wendy. It seems that the Gila chapter has a good relationship with these folks. So I would utilize that. On their website, xerces.org, they have wonderful pamphlets and resources for each little part of the US, the Southwest being one of them. Homegrown National Park, this is a movement that I love. It's essentially putting up, signage and making your yard part of this collaborative, cooperative, how would I want to say this, movement, where let's say you and all of your neighbors, you all decide to allow your garden to be a national park. You plant native, you allow it to be a little wild. And by doing that, you're creating continuous habitat rather than bees having to okay, I can live here, but if I go to the neighbor's house, he's got pesticides, things like that. It's you kind of championing for and being a supporter and a spokesman for these bees. And the Pollinator Partnership at pollinator.org is another fantastic resource. There's also some really great books out there. These are two that I love. I think Don just said that he got The Solitary Bees and that it's been fantastic. Highly recommend it. It is a little more science heavy. If you're more comfortable with citizen science, or you like just kind of a more infographic type book and less heavy reading, Bees in Your Backyard, I love it. Talks about seasonality, talks about the floral preference, the nesting, has tons of pictures, more than I could cover today, unfortunately. So highly recommend that one. With that, I'll go ahead and stop talking and allow for some questions. I do have my contact information here. So if we run out of time, feel free to message me. I'm happy to answer any other questions.
All right. Well, gosh, thank you so much, Ali. That was fantastic. And it's great to see your presentation the second time around. I'm wondering.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm wondering, there are a lot of folks who, in thinking about honeybees, especially, I think, are allergic and have some very serious allergies and, life-threatening allergies to bee venom. And I'm wondering about if we are encouraging people to attract these native bees to their yard. What kind of considerations are there with that? Is it similar to what the reactions in a honeybee?
Well, there's good news. So with honeybees, because they're from somewhere else, their venom and the proteins in their venom are actually pretty different from most of our native bees. However, allergic reactions are a very serious thing, right? I'm not going to say, oh, you might be able to get stung. The great news, though, is that with solitary bees, because they're by themselves and they don't have, thousands of sisters as backup, for the most part, they behave a lot more like flies, where if they're startled or they're, concerned that you're going to eat them, they're going to fly away. You can dig up their nest and there's nothing they're going to do about it. They're going to say, that's okay, I'll make another one. They're not going to all come after you. So by promoting native and usually solitary bees in your yard, they're not going to have that same territorial response that you'd expect from a eusocial bee, like a honeybee.
Thank you. There was a question about what's your favorite bee, Ali?
Oh, yes, I love this question. So I'm actually working on my PhD, hoping to look for Lasioglossum texanum, which again, the Lasioglossum are those itty bitty ones. There was the picture of one on my finger. Um, so this bee is special because on top of all the cool behavior I already just talked your ear off about, this bee flies at night. So it's fascinating, just an incredible bee. And I'm working currently with Dr. Brett Seymour here at UTEP, who studies artificial light pollution and how that's affecting animals. So I'm hoping to find this bee, look at its pollination habits under different light conditions to see if light pollution is also something we should worry about for bees. But yeah, thank you for asking. Too
So
many bees, but that
we
one's my favorite.
know that you are interested in crepuscular bees and behavior. So give us just a little taste of that.
Yeah, so essentially the thought is that these bees sort of diverged from the other bees and tried to move towards being a little more, yeah, nocturnal or crepuscular, dusk flying, to evade predation. So bees do get eaten by birds. If you've watched kingbirds or other insectivorous birds, they do eat bees. They don't mind it. So these itty bitty tiny bees flying under the cover of dark, usually with just the moon to guide them, they're going to just fly out to their nest and fly home, and they're usually just fine. Out where you all live too, there's oh shoot, what are they called? I can't remember the common name for them. It's a type of coleted bee. So the cellophane bees, where I showed a picture of the nest that had that strange little cellophane lining. But they're really early flying bees. They fly at like right at sunrise. Really fantastic. So in your area, you should look for those guys.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Do we have African bees in the Southwest?
Yes. So with the Africanized bees, that is basically a hybrid species of Apis mellifera, so of the European honeybee. And what happened there was due to concerns, especially in the agricultural world, right, about for a time there was concerns about honeybee hives collapsing, right, the colony collapse disorder, which is a whole other thing I won't get into. But due to fears about it, there was this effort to try and mix Apis mellifera with a different subspecies that's found in Africa to try to make them hardier to extreme heat and things like that, thinking about climate change. But what wound up happening is these bees, they behave a little differently. So they do exist. I know there are some suspected cases in our area, but the somewhat good news there is it's thought that they're going to sort of breed themselves out, that as these European honeybees and the Africanized hybrid bees are breeding, that they're going to sort of dilute those characters, or at least that's what I understand. I'm really sorry, I'm not an expert on honeybees by any means, but that's so far what I understand on that. I would exercise some caution if you do see hives, but for the most part, it's one of those like, unfortunately, you won't know until you get a case, right?
Yeah, thank you. And we have a lot of thank yous, great presentations, wonderful presentation,
Aw,
et cetera, et cetera. So
wonderful.
does anyone else have something to put into the chat box? Question?
If there's no other questions, I will say another thing I thought I had put in my slide. I must have saved a previous version. I'm sorry. Is trying to get photos of bees on the flowers in your yard and putting them like on iNaturalist can also be a really great way to have your bees identified. If you don't, have access to bees in your backyard or these other books, that can be a really easy and great way to get someone to tell you what kind of bee you have.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not seeing a lot. Okay, here. Are there certain altitudes at which certain bees survive or can't survive?
Oh, with altitudes. Yeah, so they're with altitudes, I think what really changes for these bees is the temperature. So there are bees that are slightly more cold adapted than others. Most of our desert Southwest bees, they are not cold tolerant, not by any stretch. Once it gets down below freezing, they might have a couple of nights and then they're done. But some, like bumblebees, for example, not any of the species we have, I think, but bees out east and especially in the Midwest, those bees can fly at much colder temperatures than others. And on top of that, the European honeybee also, I think, is a little bit more well adapted to the cold temperatures because they're from Europe, right? They're used to a cold, rainy day. They'll go out and forage anyway. They're okay.
So, I have a question. Is the another African bee question, is the African bee a threat to all of the other bees that you talked about?
Oh, that's interesting. So, as far as I know, I don't think that they specifically go after, native bees or anything like that. But one thing I will say that's sort of being debated currently in bee science is whether European honeybees, Apis mellifera, the big colonies, whether they're taking advantage of these finite resources to sustain this massive colony, whether that might be pushing out native bees who can't fly as far, can't really defend themselves as well, are sort of at a disadvantage there. So that's one thing that I'm sure is being looked at currently. Unfortunately, I'm not one of the ones looking at that, but it's something to keep in mind about honeybees, and the Africanized bee is certainly part of that.
So Dinah wants to know if climate change is affecting bloom time of food plants and therefore impacting native bee survival.
Yes, so the temporal mismatch is something that a lot of bee scientists are afraid of right now. And through working with Dr. Kevin Floyd, who's part of the Native Plant Society down here in El Paso, or well, in Las Cruces, we're basically New Mexico though. We've been studying and observing bees as they forage on plants for a few years. And that's really the only way we're going to be able to tell whether, the Mahonia flowered in March last year, and this year it flowered in, maybe a week later, whether that's just inter-year variation, we had a cold snap this year, or whether this is part of a long trend. The worry there is, especially for specialist bees, if they have an environmental trigger to emerge and begin foraging and begin their adult life cycle, but their plant is not ready to bloom yet, that is a fear. That is definitely a fear. And it's something that a lot of folks want to keep an eye on. So things like posting on iNaturalist, again, I mean, invaluable. Having just any data about what time of the year these guys are active can help with that kind of research.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we would love to be able to do is to train members all across this state to be able to recognize bees, to learn how to make, what's important, what kind of information is important to report. I think that would be valuable. So we're gonna. Okay, Mary Barrett has a question about how many generations of bees hatch. This is a great question. How many generations of bees hatch in a calendar year if adult bees only live a few weeks?
Yes, great question. So many of these bees will actually lay separate nests, and they'll sort of continue nesting as long as they're around. There's also bet hedging of the bees that are emerging. So basically what's happening, you'll have generations of bees all laid out in separate little nests by one bee. And as the emergence triggers are coming around the following year, some might say, okay, I'm going now. And the rest will say, no, it's not humid enough. I'm going to wait another few months. I'm going to wait another few weeks. I'm going to wait. And this depends on the group you're talking about, the species or the genus. But this is pretty common where you'll have one bee laying, I mean, as many eggs as she possibly can, usually probably around a dozen or so. And just sort of like any other insect you'd imagine, it's kind of just a numbers game. So I can't really say how many generations there would be. I know in some bees, it feels like they're present, that species is present from March through like August. It has to be, I mean, tons of these generations just all kind of following one another. But that one, I can't generalize. I'm really sorry. That's going to be a highly variable question depending on what bee we're talking about.
Yeah, and if people are interested in those types of questions, the book on solitary bees will fill your mind for all possibilities. It's just amazing. So Marty has a question. Would you comment on capturing and archiving specimens?
Yes, so that's actually what I've been working on for many years now at this point. Behind me is actually the rack of specimens that we've collected over the past few years. So it's an important and I mean a relatively sad thing, but a very important thing for bee identification particularly. There's only so far that you can get with looking at a bee without having it under a microscope. It's to the point that, I mean, there are specimens that are literally, we have to look at them for hours just to try to figure out what genus it is. So that's why, you know, something like a bee workshop, it's going to be difficult, but I mean, I know y'all are capable of it. It's one of those things where a specimen can make the difference between it was an apid, it was some kind of apidae bee, or yeah, that was a diadasia. So it's incredibly important, and they're also great vouchers for the time, the place, and the plant they were collected on. So that's something that I do. I mean, I'm currently in UTEP's entomology collections room. So this is something that the Xerces Society will tell you, we need physical specimens. Now, as far as would you comment on capturing and archiving specimens? If you're asking for instructions, that's going to be a whole other rant, unfortunately.
Any other?
I think that's it.
Okay, I'm just trying to see if there.
That was it.
I think that was the last question. So hey, it's 8:01, and
excellent timing.
Yeah, and it was just so informative. And we had 52 screens on Zoom tonight, and I think that it's got to be a record for our Gila Native Plant Society, and it's just a testament to this buzz around native bees. It's incredible, and anything that we can do to help educate folks about the importance of these bees is we're working hard.
There we go.
So
I can tell, and that I'm so glad that people were interested in this. I mean, again, I know the native plant people and native bee people, we have to be good friends. But I'm so flattered and so honored that you all care and listen. That's fantastic. I already know. I mean, just if you go out and watch some bees, you're going to learn a ton. It's going to be awesome.
Yeah. So I think that maybe we'll take up a collection tonight to get your car fixed. Because we would love to have you here in person the next time.
I would love to meet you all in person. Yes. Well, I'm sorry, Donna Wendy, I have met you technically since you came to El Paso. But yeah, no, that's my, if anyone's a mechanic, my clutch went out on my car. So that's going to be, oh boy, I don't even want to think about it right now. I'll get out there at some point.
On that sad note, we thank you so much, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. All right, y'all have a good night.
Yeah, good night.
Stop recording.